Hello, folks. Welcome to Sweet Spot Safari number 20. Today's topic is employee and employer, and we have an awesome guest today. Hello, Glenn Martin, co-founder of Never Mind the Job Spec. Glenn's a recruiter and also a podcast host under the same title. Glenn, welcome, pal. And can you share a bit about your who you are and also the story behind Never Mind the Job Spec?
Yeah, it's quite a mouthful, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, it is.
Well, listen, good to be here with you and John, and thanks for the invite to come on the podcast. So who am I? So for all intents and purposes, I'm a recruiter. I have been for over 18 years. And I think the thing that I always find quite interesting in recruitment is people have lots of different types of job titles: talent acquisition professional, talent, kind of sourcer, et cetera, which, kind of indicates the different levels of experience you have. But for all intents and purposes, you're a recruiter, and that's not a rude word or something you should be ashamed of. You know what I mean? And I have a mixture of experience. I did 10 years agency side, so I really understand recruitment from a kind of service supply perspective. But there was an inflection point for me after those 10 years. I was like, we need to do more. We need to do better, both by the individuals that are looking for jobs, candidates, and we could do a lot more to kind of support and educate people in their companies to hire better. So I went out on my own, did contracting for about 4 to 5 years. Two reasons for that. One, to kind of get a whole collection of experience in different industry sectors. Two, to kind of answer the question I had in my mind, which was, am I as good as I think I am? You know what I mean? Am I actually any good at this, or have I just been kind of in this in this bubble of corporate for 10 years? And I think I'm pretty good at my job, but have I really been tested? And so I did that, and then 18 months ago, I established Never Mind the Job Spec, which is a recruitment solutions, talent acquisition solutions business that partners with pre-seed up to Series A funded startups to really focus on human-centered hiring. And human-centered hiring is essentially something that I think I always did intuitively, but never really thought about it in terms of the context within the overall experience. So the last 18 months has really been developing and understanding what human-centered hiring actually is. And we're still on that journey, don't get me wrong. It's a process of kind of continual learning, but I can, kind of come to that in a bit more detail as we get into it. But yeah, that's me. Oh, and I'm a founder and CEO, if you want job titles. Those are my two.
Great stuff.
I think job titles quite important in your line of work, Glenn.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised, John, how much people fixate on job titles.
Oh,
still.
I'm not surprised at all. I just think sometimes I see even businesses, larger SMEs, actually substitute jobs title for remuneration as a means of building ego, which is something I'd like to explore a bit later on, because I'm fascinated about your journey and also what you've got to offer. So cool, interesting times. So Ben, over to you.
Yeah, well, it struck me actually. As you know, this podcast is really just exploring opposites, patterns, things which seem to kind of be in tension with one another, and the employee and employer is quite often seen in tension with one another. But actually struck me with your role, you are almost like this bridge, this kind of sweet spot in practice with the work which you do, which is seeing both sides of the fence, which I think is pretty cool. And so we'll have a think about just where we are now. And actually, I guess we go through periods in jobs markets where it might be a candidate market or it might be an employer's market. And I where are we now? Because there seems to be a lot of changes going on in the world. And can you just give us almost like a kind of helicopter view of some of the changes going on in the jobs market? Is that okay?
Yeah, well, as much as I can offer my knowledge, Ben, I will. Yeah, I think one thing I would say is I kind of refrain from classing myself as a quote unquote expert, right? Anybody that says they're an expert, you gotta look for their Nobel Prize, right? That's what I'm looking for. That's expertise.
Yeah.
I think for me, in terms of what I've seen and what I've experienced, I can talk to that. And you're right. I think there's a couple of things that we need to consider here, which is one, kind of technology progression, which always changes the dynamic between employer employee, and I think we're seeing that at the moment. I think the second significant piece is the kind of broader social impact of kind of post-COVID world, and then the third is really for me the number of generations we have in the workforce now, and those three streams I think are influencing the jobs market, if you will. And you kind of say, well, we're post-COVID now, but but actually there was a significant change in dynamics, I think, owing to kind of COVID and what the challenge it presented us and how people think and feel about their life in relation to the work that they do. This possibly become more pronounced. But if we start with the kind of first piece, which is on a technology progression, right? So we've gone from obviously the industrial age, and then we're moving into a kind of almost like it feels like a rapidly progressing kind of arc in terms of kind of the utilization of technology to do work. And I think people, and I will say people in their companies, because when we talk about companies, we almost talk about this kind of large company entity, right? It's people ultimately that make up a company, and there are decision makers and leaders within those companies that ultimately define the direction of it. And I think there's a challenge there for leaders and decision makers in terms of how to utilize technology to do the work that they do probably in a competitive landscape where the competition is doing exactly the same. They're trying to assess how do we use technology to give us that kind of competitive advantage to continue our journey and meet our goals. Then that has a relationship and an impact in terms of our people in our business and how we, the types of roles that we're hiring, the type of technology that we're using now versus the type of technology we want to explore and use it going forward. And that changes the dynamics of the kind of role profiles and obviously the sort of hiring patterns. And this is all at a very high level, right? I'm kind of happy to go into a bit more detail. So I think that's one challenge that I don't know if it's getting enough airtime alongside AI is going to basically take everybody's jobs, which it's kind of you've seen this week in terms of the kind of is it the AI Safety Summit?
Yeah, so
it's one in Bletchley with
Park,
Rishi and Elon. Yes,
so it's interesting to me that there's obviously the recognition of the importance of AI, which is great, and it's also interesting to me that the UK government had been setting up a board and a council for the moral ethics of AI probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Yeah. So this is not new to them, but ultimately there seems to be a reason why this is really sort of being pushed onto the.
Well, it's interesting because I went to a presentation in Cambridge actually at Churchill College a number of years ago called the Beckett Public Policy Institute, and they had Martha Lane Fox speak, and I think she was the digital czar at the time, and they were talking about ethics in AI and cognitive bias, which I find sort of very interesting. And at the time, I think then Germans were taking the lead, and there was a lot of fear, particularly around, shall we say, without being too judgmental, what are considered to be rogue states like Russia and China in that respect anyway. So I think that's quite interesting. So you make a really good point. What I find fascinating actually is because I really want to explore this thing of AI. I actually went to a presentation on generative AI last night in Cambridge at Fitzwilliam College, which was really interesting. But the sense I get, listening to IT professionals and the people who are inside it, and also, on other podcasts, is that the people on the inside of it don't fear it at all. And I think that seems to be that they've got a perspective that maybe the people on the outside don't have, which could be, fearmongers, sort of fear-based algorithms and all the social media stuff that's going on. Because all I'm hearing at the moment with the sort of communities that are immersed in it is actually it's a massive opportunity to make work way more meaningful and dump transactional work, repetitive work. And I'm going to declare my colours now. I'm very much in the let's embrace it, but with controls.
You've made a really interesting point there, John, in so much as the people inside it don't fear it because they understand it, they're working with it, they can understand its potential, right? But if you're, say, for instance, in the legal industry sector or the accountancy sector, and you're not inside and understanding the potential benefits of AI, and you're hearing that the utilization of AI could, kind of change your role, and your employer isn't talking to you about that change, they're not talking to you about training to essentially pivot and change your role to a more progressive and more creative, a more interesting role for you, then ultimately your position is going to be, I don't want this change because I don't know what's the other side of it for me. So I think this kind of feeds into this stream around, kind of technology progression, how people, leaders, decision makers are kind of dealing and strategizing and thinking about that, but equally how they're communicating that to their current team and their current workforce. And if there's not that inclusivity, then ultimately there is going to be fear, or not so much fear, but there's going to be questions, and unanswered questions can be frustrating. They can lead to fear, indecision, and people deciding to leave that business before any quote unquote real decision is made.
No, exactly. So it's, if I may, a follow-on sort of question observation. What you've highlighted is so true. If I look at any industry, my background is productivity and lean, and the first thing we do is communicate the vision once we've set up the vision. And if you look at any classic change management model, whether it be Kotter, Lewin, some of my own ones, etc., first thing you do is you've got to recognize you've got a problem. So that's awareness and recognition. But stage 2 in any process is getting buy-in, which is the communications piece. If you don't get buy-in, all the stuff that sits behind it, stages 3 to 6 or 3 to 8, which involves staffing, implementation, planning, and execution, they just will not work. And it never ceases to amaze me how companies now, even with all this technology in the work, fail to do the basics, which is communication, right? And eliminating fear, and moving to a value-based or a value-centric approach.
Yeah, and I think just one counterpoint to the insiders not fearing it. I guess there was the quite famous several hundred AI professionals and organizations a few months ago writing a letter saying, look, we need a 6-month break, 6-month pause on this because actually this could get out of hand. So that there are some people within, deep within Silicon Valley, perhaps, that do fear this, but then maybe this is more like a marketing campaign, actually, by saying, look, hold us back. This thing is coming. This is going to be really something serious. Actually, we need a 6-month pause. Almost creates more interest, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, what is going on here? But beneath the surface. So, yeah, I guess in some ways we kind of think of this as more of a concern from an employee point of view, that actually, AI is going to take our roles, or as John pointed out, or maybe actually will just take the more boring stuff and actually allow more meaningful work and creative work to happen. But there's also a perspective of what AI means for organizations. And so there was this I can't remember, that you're probably familiar with it, John, a McKinsey study back in the 1960s, like the average lifespan of an organization in the S&P 500 in America was something like about 65 years. And 50 years later, I think in like 2015, it had been reduced down to 15 years. So the cycle, the longevity of a business is shrinking as change increases. And so I kind of wonder, actually, AI from an organizational, from a business point of view, is existential as well, potentially, because you've got the new starters suddenly coming from nowhere, like the Amazons, Googles, they're the kind of new, they're the new landscape. So any legacy business must fear AI as well. So I don't know if we talk about that as much as from just replacing single jobs.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, because your analogy has just really made me think, is that if you look at animals and the human race, right, and the gestation periods and cadence, I'm no veterinary scientist, but if you look at the longevity of those corporations, right, it's shortening. But that's because the cadence of change is probably increasing. And it's a bit like the heart rate of an animal, isn't it? Smaller animals with a very, very high heart rate tend to have short lifespans, right? Because there's a lot of change. If you imagine the heart pumping, it's a very short cadence. Whereas if you look at elephants, for instance, they have a very long lifespan because they have a relatively slow heart rate. So I think that's quite interesting. Is it the amount of energy consumed for an organization in a period of time, which, can be short cadence and high intensity? And I think it's interesting, as you say, that, one perspective can say the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, etc., have got an unassailable position now because they control the data and the space and everything else. But as we're seeing with some businesses, I see that who's the guy today? Sam Friedman, has just been prosecuted, hasn't he, for Exchange FTX? Right? That was a huge startup with billions, and literally it fell off the cliff pretty quickly, and also it's been prosecuted pretty quickly. So I think, to me, it's and I'd love Glenn to come in on this one. It's almost about challenging paradigms as well. Not only is the cadence and the landscape changing, but of thinking about the landscape, it has to constantly change as well, because things are just not as what we expect. So I don't know how that relates to the world that you're in, Glenn.
Yeah, I think yeah. So, I mean, it fits into that kind of speed of technology change. And let's be fair, sometimes I think you get the impression that every company is keeping pace and on the cusp of that technology change. The reality is they're not. There's always, the early adopters, and then there's the late majority, basically everybody else, right? So everybody else, the late majority, are trying to understand what this means for them. And that can take time. Ultimately, depending on who you have in the business and how you approach that kind of research and understanding, right? So, case in point, yourself, John, right? You're actively going out into these communities and trying to learn. Now, some would argue that is the best and only way to really understand what the impact will be for your business. I mean, I don't know, but if we did a poll of kind of senior leaders in kind of UK companies, I would imagine the minority of them are actually doing something like that. They're either relying on that research to be presented to them internally based on what it means for the business, as opposed to going out firsthand and trying to actually understand the landscape and bring that back into the business. You know what I mean? So for me, I think there is that kind of early adopter, which we seem to be focusing on now. Like all these people that are at the forefront of the change, that are kind of creating and shaping the narrative around how AI will be utilized, the regulation, et cetera, and then there's everybody else waiting to understand what that means for them at different stages. And I think, again, it comes back to that point that we were talking about in terms of the relationship between the employer and the employee. That is just one stream. That is one kind of pillar that we're essentially, kind of within the world of employment that we're dealing with at the moment. The second is almost the social impact of that. So it's kind of, and it brings me to the second tier of kind of post-COVID world, or certainly post-pandemic, right? Which is within, and we notice this quite readily, actually. One of the questions that we were asked quite consistently when we were hiring, when we were all free to move around and get back to quote unquote normal life, was, how did the company you're representing treat their employees during COVID? What did you do? Did you furlough them? Did you make redundancies? Were you able to keep them kind of busy, active? What kind of sort of mental health well-being support did you provide? What was the collaboration, communication? Did you have to did they have to transition from quite a traditional in-office 5 days a week model to kind of a fully remote model? What are you doing now? So that was quite an interesting conversation to have, because I think to certain companies, they didn't realize they would have to answer that question. And that is driven by, I think, people's need to understand how they're going to be treated going forward, because they saw so many different stories around, you know, kind of, I can't remember the name of the guy that basically went on a Zoom call and sacked like 100 people. So they were seeing these stories and probably experiencing themselves first and foremost, you know, that as an employee, and thinking this dynamic has to change. And that has driven now, I think, a very different type of social contract between the employer and employee, which will stay, by the way. It's not going to change.
No, I would agree with that. But I'm interested to get Ben's reflections here, because I've got some follow-on questions. But Ben, I could see that you were.
No, you go for some follow-on questions.
Okay. I think what you say just totally resonates with me. I mean, there's a general fear in the world anyway, because of geopolitical and global events anyway. But I think my next question then is, do you think, on the basis of what you said, that social contract has changed? Because the impression I get is that employees become more value-based and very sort of, what's the word? Not necessarily critical, but asking critical questions of their employees around values and around systems and how they're going to be treated. Do you feel that the pendulum has shifted, so that now the balance has shifted in favor of the employee? Because, of course, right at the head of the conversation, traditionally, it's always been that the employer, they're the ones that are offering the job. They've got the packages. They're the ones that are in control. Do you think there's been a sort of power shift, Glenn, towards the employee? And maybe that's a trite question.
Yeah, I think, again, I think these kind of traditional views of employer-led market, employee-led market, I think they're too static, I think, in terms of the actual reference of it. I think it's a lot more fluid. I mean, ultimately, it really does depend on, you know, kind of, what does your business do? Therefore, what skills and experience do you require within your team members? And at what point are you hiring? And, you know, what are the drivers for hiring? And there's all these different things that contribute to, quote unquote, the kind of power dynamic. But I think more broadly, it's just a bit more parity in terms of that dynamic. So to your point, historically, there may be the kind of perception, and it's probably quite true. I'm the employer, I have a job, therefore I have, you know, a kind of greater power when it comes to the selection of people that we want to hire and how we want to hire them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think now, because we do have, and this is the third tier, we have, you know, kind of 4 generations in the workforce now. That kind of traditional fixed mindset around hiring is being challenged and will continue to be challenged. And I think employers with that mindset are going to struggle to hire, because ultimately it's a longer conversation now around kind of hiring. The potential new employee has a lot more questions and wants more transparency, wants more understanding, wants more understanding of the kind of values that the company holds. And that links back to that kind of social contract dynamic from COVID, right? It's not enough just to have a bunch of values splashed on your website.
Yeah.
If you as a leader in that business cannot point to where you have observed one of your team members living that value within the last week, if you can't answer that question, if somebody says to you, okay, you know, talk to me about when you've seen these values lived in your business, it kind of penetrates that kind of illusion of values, right? But they are super important. Certainly when you think about millennials, when you think about, they're driving that. It's what they want to know now. So I think companies, to that point around the power dynamic, I think it's just parity now, because there's a lot more information for the individual looking for a job. They have a lot more to decide whether it's the right role, and they will ask questions and they will want to know more before they make a decision as to whether to join that particular group of people in their business. So yeah, I think, you know, the days of candidate-led, employee-led market, I think it's almost an oversimplification. You know what I mean? It's a bit of a classic recruitment spiel.
Paradigm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
And just so on this parity perspective, then where do you stand on the work from home, work in the office, hybrid approach to work? I'm guessing you still work probably quite a lot at home. I do bits and pieces at home. I wouldn't want to do everything at home. Is there some sort of parity being kind of reached there? Some sort of optimal balance?
So I saw this question written down, Ben. I was like, man, I love this one, because I think it's you now have to create the conditions for that employee, that team member, to do their best work. If that's 100% remote, if that's hybrid, if that's in office, you need to be able to offer that to them. And you need to be able to factor that into your org design, and you need to factor that into the way you lead. And I think this is one of the things that perhaps individuals experienced during lockdown, leaders that were completely incapable of leading in a virtual environment. They needed that person sitting there in front of them on, kind of in the office. So I think, so I think the kind of, hybrid, 100% remote in office, it shouldn't really be like a set of choices. It's how do you do your best work in relation to obviously the work that we need you to do, what environment you need to set up. I had a conversation with a company just in the last 2 weeks, and they are a classic example of this change this requirement to offer that flexibility is here to stay. It's not a kind of post-pandemic kind of thing that at some point everybody will just return to the office because that's what they need. So it's here to stay. And I think it's reinforced by certainly, kind of millennials and Gen Zs and how they want to do work and how they, the environment they want to be in. And you're either going to factor that into your org design and your leadership style, and you're actually going to go on a really positive journey with your kind of team members, and it's actually going to be more of a kind of conversation, or that change is going to happen to your business. But equally, in the first instance, what you're going to notice is people are just not going to join you. So your first experience is going to be people are going to opt out of joining your business because you do not offer that flexibility and that kind of understanding of how best that individual wants to work. So what you're going to feel first and foremost is a whole bunch of pain because you're just losing staff and you can't replace them. So that change, that's the first experience of them. That change is happening to your business, but you're not seeing it. You're seeing it as some sort of market challenge, or you're seeing it as some sort of hurdle. You need to incorporate this into the way that you work now as a team. And if you do that, you're going to give yourself a better opportunity to hire people, kind of medium to long term, as it were. So I don't even think it's a question now. Can we offer? Should we offer? It's how can we best provide a kind of environment for that person to do their best work.
It's really interesting what you say. That is, I mean, that's extremely powerful. I'm again following the theme of parity, because I think the topic, patterns and polarities, of employer and employee, is, I think what you described before was this fluidity between the two in terms of that sort of dynamic. And going back to what you said earlier, I've seen more vision and value statements on walls as wallpaper where people couldn't answer that I could shake a stick at, and I'm a great fan of the Japanese culture. And, the one that they do is, you can go to an organization and virtually everybody, without being automatons, from top to bottom, the organization can actually recite the value statements when asked, because they're living and breathing them, not because they've trained themselves to do them. But to this point again is, and I'm thinking with the evolution of websites like Glassdoor, for instance, do you think as well as part of this process, Glenn, that potential candidates now are doing a lot more research than they would have done before, because there's access to information that maybe they wouldn't have had before with the internet? I think back to the days of my recruitment days, standard application forms back in the mid 1980s, you'd fill out the form, and if you were lucky, you might be able to write and find a report at company's house on a financial statement of a corporate, or even before the website. So you wouldn't even have a list of demographics or number of employees or anything else. You'd have to go and get a financial report. Obviously, that's a long time ago, now. So
yeah, man. I mean, yes, John, I think there's a whole wealth of information out there on companies now, but it's which information is valuable to that individual when they think about potentially an application. Now, there's certainly within the recruitment world, there's two strands. There's the employer brand and the talent brand. Now, the employer brand is the bit that the employer can control. It's the content they want to push out. It's the recruitment marketing content. It's where they have an influence over the information that's being provided. The talent brand is the organic narrative around your business. So, case in point, Glassdoor, social media, kind of online communities, etc. Now, you can have an influence on that talent brand, but you can't control it. But the talent brand has more value to the applicant than the employer brand. The employer brand may pique their interest. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. I like the look of that company. That's a really slick video. Those people seem nice. But then they flip onto Glassdoor because they want the real world truth. So that is the piece that I think, we always kind of talk to companies around. Yeah, you've got an employer brand. What's your talent brand like? And oftentimes they don't know. They don't know the difference. They just kind of interchange. Oh, our employer brand is our talent brand. No, they're completely different. And this comes to the point around that third tier in relation to the generations in the workforce. The talent brand is far more important because there's far more value, honesty, transparency in what's going on around the talent brand, that organic conversation, that interaction with somebody you used to work with, or somebody that's referred you to that particular company that has that insight to the real world of that business. And I think that piece is, just to summarize, there's a lot of information out there. Well, which information is more valuable and which information is going to give that individual the confidence to take that action to say, hey, John, I like the look at your company. Here's my application, or I'd like to talk a bit more about the opportunity.
Yeah. It sounds very interesting. And I want to bring Ben in here. It's very much about walking the talk, isn't it? What you describe is that the companies can push a lot of information out there and into the pipeline, etc., but it may have no resonance whatsoever is if the talent brand and what other people are saying and they're not walking the talk is totally different. And that's very much the value for the candidate. And of course, if there's a disconnect there, then they're probably not going to get the hires that they need. So yeah.
I think people in their companies are scared of the talent brand because they have to engage, they have to answer questions. Like on Glassdoor, I had a really crap interview experience. Don't run away from that. Lean into it. Okay, so, Ben, you had a really poor interview experience. Can you tell us more about that? Because we want to improve. We want that feedback. If we got it wrong, we're going to own it, right? And we're going to try and understand how to improve that. And again, that adds to your talent brand advocacy as opposed to, kind of a slick employer brand video about how it's great to work here.
Yeah. With lots of shots looking over balconies and seascapes with
yeah, exactly. In a really nice office, like, man, it's really great to work here, and those sort of things. I mean, to be honest, they do make me cringe. Because it's kind of, whilst I don't question the kind of intent or the validity of the person that's being asked those questions, it's so structured in a way that ultimately they don't really have the opportunity to say, you know what, I've had it really tough here in the first 2 months. It was a very different culture for me. I'd been in a business that was like, kind of for like 4 or 5 years, etc. It was a real shift for me, but I knew that coming into the interview process, and I wanted that for myself. But I still found this period of kind of adaptation was quite challenging. But X was a great mentor and leader, helped me with that. I had a couple of chats. Those sort of things you don't see, and you'll never get on an employer branded video. But actually, that is the real valuable stuff, because that's what, to your point, is the truth behind, or the truth of the culture, the truth of what people are experiencing.
Yeah, and I think on that, what comes up, there's something about the artificial or kind of staged nature of those videos, which we can all see through. And even the bit at the beginning of this this episode, I quite often trip up at the beginning, because I kind of feel like there's a kind of process we need to go through to do the official kind of, to get to the actual meat of the conversation, which always feels a lot more natural to me. But the first bit I kind of really struggle with, and it makes me think about the interview process. I think every business has had multiple people like fantastic in an interview, and then when they come onto the team or come into the organization, they're a completely different person. And so it makes me think about the nature of interviews and how they are staged in a way that people can game them. You can kind of prepare for an interview. You can kind of give this inauthentic impression of you in an hour, in much the same way that we study exams at school. You can basically prepare for an exam and know exactly what's coming up, and without actually really understanding any of what's being asked. So I'm just interested in that interview process and how that's possibly changed.
Yeah, I mean, what you're referring to there, and what we know from an education point of view, is propositional knowledge, right? It's known knowledge that you can retain and kind of regurgitate in an exam situation. So just as a small kind of side conversation, we have kind of partnered with companies that have kind of put technology at the front of the kind of recruitment process to try and kind of understand a bit more about the person, and kind of strip out unconscious bias, which I think is the right approach. Kind of trying to reduce the unconscious bias at the kind of initial application stage is a worthwhile, intentional action. But then ChatGPT came along, and ultimately, how do you know that the answers to those questions in that particular platform aren't just generated by ChatGPT? Somebody's just gone, I've got 6 questions to answer. Put that into ChatGPT. Make this sound dynamic, funny, and focus on this, and this, and this. Great, cut paste. I just want to get past that piece because I want to talk to a human being. So we kind of, and it's the same kind of conversation that's going on in education at the moment. How do we know that that's kind of an authentic bit of work from a student? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that actually, if you put too much technology at the front of a particular recruitment process, what you are going to do is get people just kind of, because at that point there's no, what's the value in terms of them investing that time up front? What have you given them that has motivated them to invest that time and effort?
Yeah,
and in most cases, the answer will be, well, we're just trying to make for you, the employer.
That's such a powerful point, isn't it? Because there's just a number of dynamics going on there. There's ego of the employer, the collective ego of the employer, trying to show how clever they are, what I mean, by the amount of technology they use at the front end. And some people used to say that was around psychometric testing as well, which I think it has its place, and I'd like to come back on that. But something that I'm very passionate about, and it's around the polarities again, about some of the, dare I say, crassness of some of the interview processes. If you look at the far extreme, so at one end, if you observe, you can have a very, very rigorous process at the front end for a relatively, I would say, low pay but moderate job at one end, almost to the point where it's ridiculous, because that point, the people don't even necessarily need to know whether they want to work there or not yet. As you said, it goes into about vested time, but the level of bureaucracy and admin, and I'm thinking particularly of civil service posts that I've seen, is just lunacy. And then you can almost do like one click now on LinkedIn for a senior VP role, which might be from $250,000 to $500,000 a year, which at one level seems sort of really bonkers, and makes me think that people not looking at the value chain. Because I'll bring in my manufacturing analogy. If you look at lean manufacturing, the value add piece, the specific bespoke is always is always at the back end of the process, not the front end of the process, so that you don't waste people's time at the front end. And I remember a few years ago when I was doing my coaching diploma, I got introduced via our coach trainer, a company called Taylor Protocols in the US. And what they were doing is they were turning standard job specs that were very transactional, very knowledge-based, as you said, proposition knowledge-based, into values-based job specs. And they actually were very bold to say that, you know, we take your job specification, we'll rewrite it for you, and we can guarantee you'll get a lot more candidates at each stage of the funnel, you know, because, you know, people were hiring for VPs and they weren't getting anything, or they're getting down to a candidate one after 3 to 6 months. And there's a lot of time invested in that. So, you know, I think I'd love to hear your sort of observations and thoughts and reflections on those points. And is, you know, are people listening to what really matters now, you know, particularly employers, you know?
Yeah, I think I definitely think that the whole dynamic of the kind of interview process is changing, is being disrupted. I had case in point that story just previously. Now, it's one thing to strip out unconscious bias via a platform at the kind of almost CV screening stage, or, you know, initial candidate screening stage. But as soon as that process hits a human being, are you actively looking at training people around their own unconscious bias? Well, in that particular scenario, I wasn't aware that they were. So you've kind of implemented something at the very beginning, but actually you haven't made that a consistent thread through the whole process. So it's kind of fragmented in that respect. And so in that scenario, we introduced a kind of 20-minute intro call. And they were like, well, why would you want to spend 20 minutes just talking to an applicant? Because it's valuable to them. Not because it's valuable to us or you, it's valuable to them. And this comes to the next point, which you kind of touched on there, John, is, you know, when we look at a kind of an end-to-end recruitment process, we look at value flow, where the value is flowing at each stage. Is it flowing, you know, in both directions, to the individual that's looking for a job and to the company? Is it flowing purely to the individual looking for a job? Is it flowing so we look at value flow through a process to ensure that it's balanced, and to try and identify opportunities to increase the value flow. And in some cases, the value flow will increase purely to the individual, the candidate, the applicant. And that's okay. Yes, it may require an investment of time, but that's a good thing within an overall overarching candidate experience. So I just wanted to kind of make that point, because you kind of touched upon, you know, almost like you say that, you know, traditionally the real value for an interviewee is in that final stage where they finally get to ask all of the questions that they've been building up all the way through the process. Well, that doesn't seem particularly fair if you look at parity and value flow. Surely a lot of those questions should be answered. And some of these questions aren't particularly complex, like benefits package, you know, hybrid flexible working, you know, kind of cultural elements. These things can be answered at the very beginning. You can give a wealth of information at the very beginning to that individual to help them decide whether they really want to invest their time. So that's the point around value flow and the overall kind of end-to-end recruitment process. In terms of interviews, I think one of the things that I'm always interested to understand is the capability of the interviewer within the business. For me, it's not enough that you've worked your way all the way up to a senior position. Great, well, fantastic. You're clearly very skilled and experienced in your role. Doesn't mean to say that you're a great interviewer. And the capability and experience of the interviewer directly correlates to the experience of the interviewee and the value and the amount of information you'll be able to get in that particular interview, whether it's one-to-one or a panel-based interview or something along those lines. So for me, that's the human element is almost the first part that we look at. Okay, who's the interview team and what's their capability level in terms of interviewing? Why are they part of this process? And we need to be really intentional in terms of, okay, capability level as an interviewer, is there some support and training that's required there? Secondly, simple question. Okay, you've got a bunch of questions here. What's the scoring matrix? What's the criteria that you can say categorically with qualitative or quantitative data points, this person meets X, Y, and Z criteria, or only X? So there's that human element, that human understanding of what is a requirement of them as an interviewer before we even start really thinking about the overall kind of complexity of the interview and what we want to take out of that. So I think, and that's the bit that sometimes I think people in companies don't do. They just think, well, we just need to get this information out of the interviewee.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a knowledge extraction process rather than building an emotional connection. You know, I think
100%, right?
The best interviews I've been involved with, and not just job interviews because of different stakes, but one where we're trying to do research, for instance, for consultancy and stuff like that, is ones where there is an emotional connection built between interviewee and interviewer. Because when that happens, that's where the magic happens. And then you get the information that you require is a lot richer, in my experience, rather than the thing that Ben alluded to earlier on, which is the sort of pre-prepared, let's down it from the cerebral library, to mean, and push it through the pipe,
Yeah, I like the idea of interviewers thinking in, or almost trying to put themselves in the mindset of like a user researcher. You're going in there to learn as much about that individual and how they interact with things and people as possible. And invariably, you'll get the kind of situational and scenario-based context of that. As opposed to, right, I've got a bunch of questions. and immediately you can see that the interviewee tense up. Right, okay, the interview started. And really great interviewers, whether it's kind of intuitively or intentionally, set the environment and scene for a conversation, because then you have somebody in front of you that is starting to relax. They realize, to your point, John, they're not going to get interrogated, but that the interviewer is interested in them. How different is that when you're sitting there and you feel like the person in front of you is interested to know more about you? Your mindset and how you approach that conversation is completely different to sitting in front of somebody that's going to fire a bunch of questions at you, and you need to kind of keep the tempo and the cadence of that going and make sure you get all the things in there that you think are relevant.
Yeah. So and that makes me think. So you've mentioned human-centered hiring, which we have to name things. We name things because often they have an opposite. So what is the opposite to human-centered hiring? So is there a name for it?
Probably transactional. I mean, so to the point around kind of maybe leaving the world of kind of contingent recruitment, I feel like that's kind of the experience that most people have, that kind of, with respect to my kind of agency colleagues who I've been that side, so I'm not going to put the boot into people, but that the structure of that service to clients requires a certain process for the recruitment process, which doesn't perhaps allow for more time, 20-minute intro calls, all that sort of thing. It doesn't allow for that. So I understand why that is still the perhaps the kind of predominant experience that people have in recruitment, and that for me is the kind of the opposite, or what I'm with the human-centered hiring. I'm me and the team are trying to prove that there is another approach which adds more value longer term. So we're not just thinking about the recruitment process, but we're thinking about, so we kind of survey individuals 3 months into their time with a particular business, not to see if they're performing or that they're delivering, because that's the responsibility of the team, the leaders, and the company to assess that. What we want to understand is the values alignment. Is that values alignment still there and evident? Is it developing? And this is the piece with kind of human-centered hiring is that, and it's going to sound like a bit of a sales pitch, but it is that dynamic intersection between candidate experience, talent brand advocacy, and values-based hiring. And I'll be honest, the values-based hiring bit is the tough bit. It's the bit that we continue to try, and we're continually learning what that means. It's not, so when I say human-centered hiring, this isn't a off-the-shelf framework that you can just plonk into a business. It's bespoke every time, but it has these tenets and principles and ideas and approaches that we implement into a business. And we just think that that approach has better long-term value for the new employee and the people in the business and the leaders than perhaps the more traditional kind of recruitment process, because we bake in things that are thinking about the longer term, as opposed to you need people with these skills and experience. Bang.
Yeah. It's an investment, isn't it? So I think
it's an investment.
Yeah. But I think this has been fascinating. Okay, we're kind of moving towards the end of our conversation. We've covered quite a few
That's a shame, man. I'm just loving chatting to you guys.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. So thanks for joining us and sharing. Some really interesting ideas, which hopefully our listeners will take away and have a think about. We like to finish these conversations with sweet spots in mind. Now, I've been mindful that you've actually been talking about things throughout. But is there any final reflections on this idea of a sweet spot between employee and employer?
I think I come back to that point that kind of John touched upon, and something that's really important to me, which is think about the value flow, because that's relevant in each one of those kind of situations, right? The kind of technology, kind of ever-changing technology, the value flow between employer and employee in terms of training them to become more, for the next phase of their career. Then you think about the value flow in terms of those, how people want to be treated in the kind of work space, that kind of social contract. And then you think about the kind of value flow between the sort of. So I think for me, just really be mindful from a hiring people team perspective about the value flow. And that can be value in terms of information, training, kind of how people work, what they think about their career progression. It can come down into the interview process, the information you're sharing along with the information you're gathering. I think that value flow is relevant in each stage. And if you really start thinking and you're intentional about a fair and balanced parity in value flow, that's a good starting point, right?
I think that's great. Great. And John, any reflections?
Yeah, just not much, but what really resonated with me, apart from the clear point about value flow, was in the last section about human-centered hiring, is remembering that there are two sides of the table here, because it would be easy to fall into a trap that says human-centered hiring is the guy that you're hiring because he's a human or she's a human, but actually not. There are humans on both sides of that table, and it's really important that there is this connection which will support the value flow, and they're both human. The human that's being hired has to do a reasonable level of preparation and ask the right questions, early on in the process, which I think is great these days. And the human on the other side has also to have the skills, the training, and the knowledge and understanding to be able to interview effectively with the team, so that value as an enabler really for that value to flow. Because if there's a disconnect on either side of and I'll say the table, the desk, whatever you want to call it, then the value isn't going to flow. And I think certainly from an employer perspective, they do have to think about enablement, and one thing that again, Cross, we've not even talked about the gig economy. The point you made, Glenn, early on about people asking questions at the front end, I think is so important, because the levels of frustration for a candidate, they can only ask those questions at the end when they've been made a provisional job offer. So it sort of feels a bit ludicrous. And not just about compensation and benefits, but simple things like, if you're on a short-term contract, for instance, because of course it's the gig economy, well, can I work in other businesses? What do I do with, intellectual property? And there's so many questions to be asked, at that front end, to make sure that you don't waste any time, for both sides in the process. So that's the thing that really resonated with me.
Therein comes into one thing that I believe in: using technology to enable better human experiences. AI shouldn't be, to your point, John, something that's super scary. It should enable us to have better human experiences. And my drive is always towards trying to make jobs, roles, allowing people to be creative as opposed to kind of static in terms of what they're doing. allowing for that kind of creativity. So, AI to enable better human experiences. If you start, with that narrative internally as a employer, leader, decision maker in the business, we're looking to utilize AI to enable better human experiences. And that can come in forms of more training, change to your job, your role, progression, etc. You would start to sort of perhaps reduce that anxiety and fear internally.
I think it's a powerful point to finish on. I think AI is here to stay, isn't it? So we might as well use it for positive purposes. So I think understanding the differences as well as how we come together, I think is really, really important. So Glenn, fantastic conversation. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us here at Sweet Spot Safari. Next up, we've got elders and youth. So check that one out in the next couple of weeks. Cool.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Really great discussion. Loved your insights today. It's got me thinking too as well. So thank you again.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, John.
Cheers.